You saw her mouth move, but the words never came. Not clearly, not once. Instead, there was a lace curtain in her voice, every syllable half buried, a candle flickering behind frosted glass. You nodded anyway, pretending you understood, but something inside you was being rewritten, not by meaning, by the absence of it. You believed it was mystery. You called it depth. You imagined she was a lake, but you were already drowning in fog. Not water. She never lied. She never told the truth. She only left you with pieces sharp enough to bleed your certainty dry. And you, poor knight of despair, mistook the silence for intimacy, the riddles for soul. You didn't fall in love. You fell through ambiguity. And in that fall, she remained untouched. If this whisper already lives in the space between her answers, let it echo. Like the video, leave your shadow in the comments, subscribe, and stay close to the silence. Because ambiguity doesn't confuse you. It controls you. And she knows. She always knew. Ambiguity is not a lack of clarity. It is a weapon that wounds without being held. You sat across from her and heard everything but understood nothing. The air shimmered with words that touched your skin but never entered your bloodstream. It was as if language had been drained of blood, leaving behind only perfume and smoke. She spoke like a hymn translated too many times. You caught the rhythm but not the meaning, and still you nodded, because nodding was safer than asking. And asking was the first sign of needing too much. There was no lie in her voice. That would have required ownership. Lies are bold, they stand somewhere. But ambiguity floats. It hovers just above reach, like a letter with no address. Her words didn't anchor. They draped over your shoulders like lace, delicate, beautiful, and completely blinding. You were looking for a door in a hallway of veils, and every time you thought you saw one, she shifted a single breath, a half smile, a soft glance away, and you were lost again. You told yourself this was depth, that she was complex, mysterious, spiritual, but you were confusing absence with transcendence. Her ambiguity didn't elevate you, it undid you. Like a man chasing the horizon, you ran further into confusion and called it love, because what else can a man do when clarity is withheld, not by accident, but with grace? She never gave you an answer. She gave you possibility, 1,000 shimmering interpretations. Every gesture was a question. Every silence was an invitation to project. You didn't fall in love with her. You fell in love with the mirror she handed you. But the mirror was warped, and your reflection came back romantic, tragic, noble. You didn't see her. You saw the shape of your need reflected through her distance. You say she was gentle, but what is more ruthless than letting someone drown in their own meaning? A sword at least tells you when you're cut. Her ambiguity was quieter. The wound didn't bleed until you laughed alone at a memory you were never sure she shared. And the worst part, you admired her for it. You admired how untouched she remained. You saw it as strength. But she was not untouched because she was strong. She was untouched because she never entered the fire. You burned alone, thinking it was intimacy. She stayed at the edge, watching the flames you mistook for connection. This was not cruelty. This was power. But the kind of power that doesn't sit on a throne, it sits in a shadow. You cannot rebel against a woman who never said yes and never said no. You cannot accuse a silence. You cannot break up with a ghost. So you orbit, hoping one day she will become solid. She won't. Her words were designed not to reveal but to control. You thought you were seducing her, but ambiguity was seducing you. And the more unclear she became, the more certain you were that meaning was just one step away, one more message, one more look, one more perfect night where everything might finally align. It was always almost, but almost is not accidental. It is crafted, it is precise. She knew the limits. She knew how far to lean before leaning became offering. She knew how to smile without inviting. She knew how to cry without collapsing. Her ambiguity was not confusion, it was strategy. A strategy rooted in Kierkegaard's despair, not the loud despair of tragedy, but the quiet one, the one that never chooses, never commits, never risks. It is safer to remain undefined because definition demands sacrifice, and she sacrificed nothing. You did. You sacrificed your clarity, your pride, your grip on the real. You began to doubt your own perception not because she denied your feelings, but because she never confirmed them. She let your words dangle. She let your questions dissolve. She let your needs speak into the void. And in that silence, you began to shrink. She never said, "I love you," but she said, "I see you." And it destroyed you more, because it was enough to keep hope breathing, but not enough to keep you alive. You began to question the very nature of language. What is a word, if not a promise? But hers were petals fragrant, weightless, falling one by one into your open hands that never closed around anything. You spoke in fire, and she answered in fog. And yet you stayed, not because you were weak, but because ambiguity is addictive. It offers something more dangerous than pleasure. It offers potential. And potential is always more powerful than reality. You loved the possibility of her more than you ever loved her, because the possibility was yours. She was not. You didn't chase her body. You chased coherence. And that is the most desperate hunger of all. Even now, you defend her. Even now, you think this is about miscommunication, but it isn't. She communicates perfectly. Her ambiguity is the message. She is the question you can never answer, the word that means whatever you want it to mean until it doesn't, until it breaks you, and you have no name for the wound. You try to call it heartbreak, but heartbreak needs closure. You don't even get that. You get echoes, you get ellipses, you get a memory that never lands. She is the lace veil soft, sacred, and blocking the altar from your eyes. You bow anyway. You believe, but belief without understanding is not faith. It is submission. And you were never loved. You were only allowed to believe you might be. So what now? Now you return to the scene again and again, replaying every glance for signs, but there were no signs. There was only fog shaped like love, and you mistook it for heaven. But it was never hers to give. It was yours to question. And in questioning, you found not answers, but your own reflection, distorted and aching. She never needed to reject you. You rejected yourself, just to stay in orbit. If this reflection already knows your silence, don't resist. Like the video. Leave your ache in the comments. Subscribe if the ambiguity still lingers beneath your skin, because her words were never empty. They were full of you, and that was the most devastating part. Ambiguous women do not offer affection. They bait your longing with half-closed doors. She leaned in, but never enough. The breath came close. The eyes held you just long enough to suggest something ancient, but the touch never followed. It was always interrupted by something convenient, a distraction, a laugh, the shifting of her weight, the rearrangement of reality just before your lips could meet hers in the way your soul already had. Already. You weren't denied. That would have granted you closure. You were suspended, an unfinished sentence in a language only she controlled. And so you waited. Not just for her affection, but for her decision. You waited for her to declare what you meant to her, for her to name the world she'd been constructing between silences. But she refused to speak it, not because she didn't know, but because ambiguity lets her rule without ever having to reign. To name something is to be held accountable to it. But to leave it unnamed, that's how a woman can become a god. She did not give you love. She gave you a cliff edge to dance on. And when you stumbled, when your voice trembled from hunger, she tilted her head like she hadn't noticed the storm inside you. She kept it charming, she kept it graceful, she kept it undecided. And you mistook that pause for patience. You mistook restraint for virtue. You thought she was giving you space to become something worthy. But what she gave you was something more cruel, a half gesture. She reached but never took. She gave but only almost. She kissed you with the tension of someone who knows the power of not finishing. And you burned for the ending. You carried the heat of it, as if the memory were complete. But it wasn't. She left you starving beside a meal she never claimed to serve. And the worst part, you excused her. You said she was guarded, wounded, thoughtful. You called her spiritual. You spun myth around her reticence. Because to admit the truth that she was feeding your desire like a slow drip would have shattered the temple you'd built around her mystery. She didn't make you feel secure. She made you feel special. And that was the hook. Because in a world that dulls every edge, she made you feel like a knife. Sharp, singular, awakened. But it was her refusal to complete anything that kept you on fire. The love was never consummated. The conversations always trailed off. Her affection was always laced with an exit. Every tender word she whispered was placed on a string, and that string was never in your hands. This was not indifference. It was control dressed in softness. You began to live in a state of near arrival. You were always just about to matter, just about to be chosen, just about to be held in full. And you shaped your identity around that almost. You became the man waiting to be fulfilled by the woman who would never arrive fully because ambiguity is how she survives. To give herself would be to lose leverage. To define you would be to close the door she keeps open for other possibilities. She never needed to cheat. Her ambiguity was already a betrayal. You could never call her out on anything. If you asked, "Do you love me?" she would smile and say, "You know how I feel." If you asked, "Where is this going?" she would say, "Let's just be here now." If you said you were confused, she would tilt her head, as if the problem lay not in her behavior, but in your hunger. She held your longing like a violin, gently, expertly, never carelessly. And every note you made for her, she recorded, but she never played you back. She just let you wonder what the sound might be, if only she'd finish the melody. But ambiguity is not silence. Ambiguity moves. It breathes. It flutters just enough to suggest motion. She didn't ignore you. She danced near you. She offered just enough warmth to keep you close, but never enough to thaw the frost she kept tucked behind her ribs. And that frost became your obsession. You thought if you could just love her right, it would melt. But that was the trick. She wasn't waiting for you to prove anything. She was watching how long you would endure the ache of almost the unfinished gesture the hand extended, the eye contact held. The door left slightly ajar is more addictive than consummation, because your imagination fills in the gaps with the most dangerous material of all, hope. She never said, "I want you." She said, "I feel something when I'm near you." That was enough, because hope is not built on confirmation. It is built on implication, and implication is her craft. She smiled at your pain, not cruelly, but gently, as if your confusion made you more beautiful. And perhaps it did. Perhaps your suffering fed something in her, something soft and ancient, something that needed to know it could still move a man without ever lowering itself into need. And you thought you were being seen, but you were being studied. You were the candle she could warm her hands by, not the fire she'd ever step into. Every time you got close to clarity, she changed tone, shifted energy, made you feel like you'd misread the moment, and you internalized that doubt. You began to question whether your need was too much, whether your instincts were wrong. You thought her ambiguity was your fault, that if you were just more stable, more confident, more evolved, she'd finally speak plainly. But ambiguity is not a phase. It is her sanctuary, and she guards it with the quiet violence of softness. You remember the last night clearly. You were staring into her eyes, asking without words if you were enough. She smiled, said nothing, and laid her head on your shoulder. It was the perfect ending to a chapter that never had a beginning. You didn't cry. Not then. You felt something deeper, the ache of meaning unconfirmed, the despair of having tasted closeness, but never being allowed to name it. You were not rejected. You were postponed, indefinitely, and that hurts more than goodbye, because you never got to grieve. You still hold space for her in your mind, a space she visits, occasionally with a glance, a text, a silence that reads like poetry, and still you wait. But she's not coming, because she never left, because she was never fully there to begin with. If these words open the wound she never touched, let it bleed. Like the video, leave your ache in the comments. Subscribe if the unfinished gesture still flickers behind your ribs, because you weren't abandoned. You were almost loved. Ambiguity is the hell of never choosing, and she thrives where you cannot leap. There's a special kind of torment reserved for the man who stands at the threshold, one foot dangling in a future he was never promised, the other sunk in a present that refuses to break. She left you there not outside, not inside, but in the vestibule of becoming. You were not banished. You were invited to wait, and wait, and wait, not with bitterness, but with hope, not with rejection, but with the curse of maybe. Maybe is the most spiritual of traps. It mimics faith, but requires no sacrifice. It looks like patience, but rots into paralysis. She never said no. She said not yet. She never turned away. She just never turned toward. You weren't chosen, but you were noticed. And so you stayed. You stayed in a limbo that felt like potential. But what is potential, really? If it's never claimed, it is despair disguised as opportunity. Kierkegaard knew this despair, the sickness unto death, the kind that doesn't scream or shatter, but slowly swells behind your ribs until the silence becomes its own religion. You began to worship the space between her yes and her no. You called it sacred, but it was a void, and voids don't nourish. They hollow. She lived there, not by accident, by nature. She knew how to draw lines in water. She knew how to open the door halfway and keep one hand on the frame, smiling like a saint as you bled in the hallway. She didn't need to manipulate you. You were already manipulating yourself, telling stories to make her indecision look like virtue. She was just reflecting the infinite regress of your own need for clarity, purpose, resolution. But ambiguity needs none of those things. It only needs time and your inability to leap without confirmation. That's what she studied. Not your love, but your hesitation. Not your affection, but your fear of letting go. She didn't offer safety. She offered mirrors endless, recursive mirrors that bent your desire back toward itself. She never had to promise you anything. You did that on your own, whispering vows into her absence. And here's the sharpest edge: you thought this was noble. You thought your endurance was proof of depth, of loyalty, of meaning. But no one awards you for suffering beautifully. No one hears your silence and calls it love except the ghost you've made of her in your mind. And that ghost will never betray you. It will never change. because it's made of your longing, not her choice. You believed that if you waited long enough, she'd become real, but she is real, just not in the way you wanted. She is ambiguity made flesh, a being who exists only in fragments, half smiles, vague replies, vanishing acts disguised as poetry. You thought she needed saving, but it was you who was drowning. You who refused to leave the shoreline she never stepped onto. Because the truth is unbearable, she likes. Maybe she breathes in it. She is not tormented by indecision, she thrives in it. And you, who crave the divine certainty of yes or no, are helpless against her. She watches you stand there trembling in spiritual exhaustion, and she says nothing. Not out of malice, but because saying something would mean becoming finite, becoming one thing. And women like her fear that more than they fear being alone. They fear choosing, because to choose is to die to every other possibility. She lives by remaining open. You die by needing closure. And that is the eternal cruelty. You call her cold, but she is not. She feels deeply, but she does not anchor. Her feelings are clouds, not roots. She experiences, but she does not bind. And to you, who believe that love must culminate in union, her freedom looks like cruelty. It isn't. It's survival. Her ambiguity is not a flaw, it's a fortress. One she built, stone by stone, from the wreckage of every man who tried to finish her story for her. You were one of them, not malicious, not controlling, just desperate for her to choose. Choose you. Choose this. Choose something. But the truth is, she cannot, and she will not, because her power lies in her refusal to collapse into clarity. Her mystique is her evasion. Her allure is in her withholding. The moment she answers, she becomes knowable. And the moment she's known, she's no longer untouchable. And that terrifies her more than your breaking ever could. So you stay broken, not shattered, just unformed, just unresolved. Maybe you were close. Maybe she was scared. Maybe next time, maybe when you're more stable, maybe when the timing's right, maybe if she heals, maybe if you wait. Maybe becomes your God. You kneel before it, lighting candles of restraint. You become holy in your non-demand. You think this restraint makes you worthy, but it only makes you invisible. She doesn't see your endurance as devotion. She sees it as background music, comforting, consistent, ignorable. And you will never be loud enough to wake her, because she is already awake. She just doesn't want to be touched. And when you finally realize this, not intellectually, but viscerally, it won't be with a scream. It will be with a sigh. A silence that spreads through your chest like ink. A mourning for every version of her you invented just to keep yourself from drowning. But drowning is sacred. Kierkegaard would have told you you must leap. Not because it will save you, but because not leaping is death disguised as dignity. You stood too long on the edge, waiting for a sign. But there are no signs, only the fog of her presence and the echo of your own refusal. She taught you this, that ambiguity can feel like connection when you are too afraid to walk away from it. That despair can dress in softness. That the absence of a no can enslave you more than rejection ever could. And now, you sit in the afterimage of her maybe. You still check her page. You still pause at old photos. You still replay old phrases, the almosts, the metaphors, the looks that hovered but never landed. You hold them like rosary beads, whispering prayers she'll never answer. But even now, you hesitate to blame her, because what if, there it is again, that final hook, the eternal maybe. If this silence already lives inside your choices, let it echo. Like the video, leave your breathless confession in the comments. Subscribe if her ambiguity still shapes your shadow. Because she never said goodbye, she never had to, a glass of wine untouched, a coat never claimed, a door that never quite closed. You call it hope, but it breathes like morning, and it waits with her just behind the veil.